Lesbian Love in Prison. Part 6. Lesbian Love. Oh. The steel door slammed behind Mara with a sound like a gunshot, and in that single echoing moment, she understood that everything she had fought to protect inside these walls was now balanced on the edge of a razor. One wrong breath, one wrong word, and it would all collapse into nothing. 6 months had passed since Mara first arrived at Ridgecrest Women's Correctional Facility, convicted of a crime born from desperation rather than darkness, and in those 6 months she had learned that prison did not strip away who you were so much as it burned everything unnecessary away, leaving only the raw, trembling truth of your soul exposed for the world, or at least for these gray, fluorescent-lit corridors on to see. She had arrived broken, carrying the weight of a life that had unraveled faster than she could gather the threads. She had not arrived expecting to find love. Nobody ever does in a place like this. And yet love, stubborn and luminous and impossible to contain, had found her anyway, in the form of a woman named Delilah, who had the darkest eyes Mara had ever looked into and the quietest kind of courage she had ever witnessed in another human being. Their story, the story of what had grown between them across meal trays and library hours and stolen minutes in the prison yard, had not been simple or clean or without cost. In Part 5, readers had watched Mara risk everything by standing between Delilah and the warden's new transfer order, speaking truths aloud that the system preferred remain buried. It had earned Mara 2 weeks in solitary, stripped of privileges, stripped of contact, stripped of the sound of Delilah's voice. Those 14 days in isolation had been the longest of her life, longer even than the trial, because in the courtroom she had at least been able to see faces and human faces, evidence that the world outside her own skull still existed. In solitary there was nothing but the hum of the ventilation system and the slow, terrible crawl of her own thoughts. When they finally brought her back to general population, blinking under the harsh lights like something dragged from deep water, the first thing Mara saw was Delilah standing at the far end of the hallway, arms wrapped around her own waist as if holding herself together by sheer force of will. Their eyes met across that long corridor and no words passed between them. None were needed. The look that Delilah gave her contained an entire universe of relief and grief, and love so ferocious it nearly brought Mara to her knees right there on the concrete floor. She steadied herself against the wall and breathed. And in breathing she remembered why she had endured those 14 days without breaking. She had endured them for this, for the chance to be in the same room as the person who had become, quietly and irrevocably, the center of her world. But Part 6 begins not with reunion, but with crisis. Because love in a place like Ridgecrest does not get to simply exist in peace. The world inside prison walls is its own ecosystem with its own politics, hierarchies and cruelties, and what Mara and Delilah shared had not gone unnoticed. There were women who resented it, some out of their own loneliness, some out of the kind of casual prejudice that survives even incarceration, and some simply because kindness between two people in a place, defined by hardness, felt, to those who had forgotten softness entirely, like a personal insult. The one who made herself their enemy most deliberately was a woman named Sergeant Bray, not an inmate but a corrections officer, a woman who had spent 15 years inside Ridgecrest and had somewhere, along the way, confused authority with ownership and discipline with punishment. Bray had been watching Mara and Delilah for weeks, filing it away with the particular attention of someone who intended to use what she collected. The morning everything came to a head began ordinarily enough. Mara was in the laundry room, running sheets through the industrial machines that groaned and steamed. In the early hours before breakfast, when Delilah slipped in through the side door with her face arranged into the carefully neutral expression that Mara had come to recognize as a mask for something deeply wrong, she crossed the room without speaking, stood close enough that Mara could feel the warmth of her, and pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand, a note, written in Delilah's careful, precise handwriting that always surprised people who expected someone with her background to be careless with words. The note said only Bray went to the warden last night. She told him about us. They're deciding this morning what to do. Mara stood for a long moment with the paper in her hand, listening to the machines thunder around her, feeling the floor vibrate through the soles of her worn prison-issued shoes. She was not naive enough to believe that this moment wouldn't come eventually. She had known on some deep, preconscious level that what she and Delilah shared could not remain invisible forever, not because they had been reckless, but because love, real love, has a visibility to it that no amount of caution can entirely conceal. It radiates. It changes the way two people move through space when they are near each other. And the people around them had seen it, whether they named what they saw or not. What followed was the longest morning of Mara's life since solitary. She went through the motions of breakfast, of work duty, of the ordinary machinery of institutional life, while inside her chest, something coiled tight and trembling, waited for the axe to fall. Delilah sat across from her at the meal table, and neither of them spoke. More than was necessary. But beneath the table, their fingers found each other for a single, brief, fierce moment of contact, just long enough to communicate everything that words in that environment could not safely carry. "Hold on," those interlaced fingers said. "Whatever comes, hold on." The summons came at 11 o'clock. Both of them called to the warden's office separately. Mara went first. She sat in the hard plastic chair across from Warden Callahan, a man whose face had the quality of long-dried leather, and she listened to him lay out what Bray had reported and what the administration was considering. He used careful, institutional language, concerns about the facility's code of conduct, issues of appropriate boundaries between inmates, considerations of transfer for the well-being of all parties. But Mara had been raised by a mother who spoke plainly, and she had learned to translate bureaucratic language back into its true meaning. And what she heard beneath his careful words was this: "We want to separate you. We want to send Delilah somewhere else. And if you make this difficult, we will make your remaining sentence considerably more painful." Something shifted in Mara in that moment. She had spent most of her life making herself smaller, in her childhood home, in her relationship with the man whose bad decisions had ultimately led to her conviction. In the courtroom where she sat silent while her life was decided around her, she had a deep and practiced instinct for shrinking. But sitting across from Warden Callahan, with the knowledge that Delilah was somewhere, down the hall waiting for her own version of this conversation, Mara felt that instinct war with something newer and stronger than the self that had been forged in 6 months of surviving Ridgecrest, the self that had learned in solitary that she could endure more than she'd ever believed, the self that loved Delilah with a clarity and conviction that felt, in that fluorescent-lit office, like the only true thing in the room. She spoke, not with anger, not with desperation, but with a steadiness that she could feel surprising the warden even as it surprised herself. She told him that what existed between her and Delilah had broken no rule that was written in any policy, document she had ever been shown. She told him that she understood his authority within this facility and had no intention of denying it. And then she told him quietly and without flinching that she would contact the legal advocacy organization that had been assigned to her case, that she would request a formal review of any transfer order issued without documented cause, and that she believed, she chose that word carefully, believed that the organization would find the grounds for such a transfer rather thin. She was not threatening him. She was simply, for the first time in as long as she could remember, refusing to be invisible. The silence that followed lasted long, enough that Mara could hear the ventilation system clicking above them. Then Callahan leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not quite respect, not quite irritation, something complicated in between, and told her the meeting was over and she could return to her unit. She walked back down the corridor on legs that felt made of something other than bone, and when she turned the corner and saw Delilah sitting on a bench outside the administrative wing, still waiting for her own summons that apparently had not yet come, she sat down beside her and told her everything in a low, steady voice. Delilah listened without interrupting, the way she always listened, with her whole body, her whole attention, as if what you were saying was the most important sound in the world. When Mara finished, Delilah was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took Mara's hand in both of hers, right there in the open corridor where anyone could see, and held it with a gentleness that felt like the most radical act of defiance either of them had ever committed. The transfer order never came. Whether it was Mara's quiet stand in the warden's office, or the legal advocacy letter that arrived 3 days later following a phone call, Mara was permitted to make, or simply the institutional calculation, that the paperwork involved wasn't worth the trouble. She never knew for certain. What she knew was that Delilah was still there, still sleeping in the bunk across from hers, still appearing at the library table where Mara read in the afternoons, still existing in the same ordinary institutional space that had somehow, against all logic and probability, become the place where Mara had discovered what it felt like to be fully known by another person. If you believe in kindness and love that refuses to be silenced, in the courage it takes to hold someone's hand in a world that tells you not to, please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love finds its way even through the hardest walls. Your support keeps these stories alive and tells us that the voices of people who love against the odds deserve to be heard. There was an evening, about 3 weeks after the warden's meeting, when the prison yard was quieter than usual, a soft, suspended kind of quiet that felt almost accidental, like the world had briefly forgotten to be loud. Mara and Delilah sat on the concrete bench near the far fence, shoulders touching, watching the strip of sky visible above the wall turn from pale blue to the deep, saturated amber of late evening. It was not a dramatic moment. Nothing was resolved in any permanent way. They were still in Ridgecrest, still subject to everything that word implied, still navigating a world that had been built to constrain rather than to shelter them. But in that small, ordinary, irreplaceable moment, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. She felt like herself. Not the convicted woman, not the prisoner, not the person whose choices had narrowed down to this, just herself. Mara, a woman who was loved by someone extraordinary, in a place that had tried its best to make extraordinary things impossible. Delilah turned and looked at her then, and without speaking she conveyed everything. The fear they had survived, the tenderness that had grown in the wreckage, the strange and stubborn beauty of finding each other here of all places, and Mara looked back and held it and did not look away. Before this story ends today, drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever found something precious in an unexpected place? Have you ever loved someone in a way that surprised even you? Let us know. Your words matter here. Some walls are made of concrete and steel, and some are made of fear and silence, and the accumulated weight of what the world has told you that you are allowed to want. Mara had spent most of her life building the second kind without realizing it. And here, in the last place anyone would have chosen, with the least likely person in the least likely circumstance, she had found someone who helped her take those walls apart. Slowly, quietly, one held hand and one honest word at a time. That is not a small thing. In a world that makes love difficult, choosing it anyway is an act of extraordinary courage. And courage, it turns out, does not require freedom. It only requires the willingness to reach across whatever space exists between you and the person who sees you and not let go.